a Cologne press, the winter of 1532. An inquisitor has stopped a book of magic, and the type is already set. Its author is Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who 2 years earlier had published a book calling Magic, Medicine, Law, and Every Other Human Science, vain, uncertain, and better not known. Did he believe a word of it, or was the whole thing a warning? This is Reliquary Obscura. Today, Cornelius Agrippa, the magic book, the attack on it, and the forgery that outlived them both. Agrippa was born in Cologne in 1486 and took his master's degree at about 16. What followed was a life that would not settle: soldier, secretary, advocate, physician, never long in one city, leaving most of them under a cloud. At 23, he finished a manuscript that gathered the whole of learned magic into 3 books, showed it to a Benedictine abbot, and was told to keep it hidden. He kept it hidden for more than 20 years. What came down to us is not the magic. It is the paper. A printed folio that survived an inquisitor and an archbishop's intervention. A scorching attack on all human knowledge, bound into the back of that same volume by the author himself. And after his death, a 4th book of spirit-conjuring that appeared under his name and that he did not write, the forgery that made him a sorcerer in the popular mind and a model for Faust. This is the survival record of Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote the books, who forged one, who denounced the forgery, and what the figures printed in them still show. Chapter 1. The 2 books. A square of 16 numbers sits in the corner of an engraving. In 1514, Albrecht Dürer cut a copper plate that later ages would call Melancholia 1. A winged woman sits among unused tools and will not look at them. An hourglass, a pair of scales, a ladder that begins and ends outside the frame. A polyhedron no carpenter would order. The space is crowded with instruments that have stopped working. Behind her, on the face of a windowless wall, Dürer placed a grid, 4 cells by 4. Every row sums to 34. Every column sums to 34. Both long diagonals do the same. The 2 cells at the bottom center read 15 and 14, the year he dated the plate. It is the first magic square printed in Europe. It is also the Jupiter square, a number talisman, the learned magic of the age assigned to the most fortunate of the planets. The square said to fend off the Saturnine humor that the winged woman embodies. Agrippa would print that same square. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. Agrippa, from here, was 28 when Dürer dated the plate, and he had not yet published a book. 19 years later, he would issue the fullest systematic survey of learned magic the Renaissance had seen, and in its 2nd book, the Jupiter square would sit among the other planetary grids, as if the numbers had always belonged to him. The integers belonged to a longer mathematics, already traveling in Arabic and Latin handbooks. What the engraving proves is simpler. And stranger, the object was already in the world, cut into copper in 1514, waiting for the book that would catalog it. Did he believe it, or was the whole book a warning? That is the question. The record will not answer it for you. It will only show what he did. In 1530, he published a declamation, a rhetorical set piece argued to the edge of paradox, whose Latin title runs to a breath, on the uncertainty and vanity of the arts and sciences, and the excellence of the Word of God. Call it the Vanity of the Sciences. It walks through medicine, law, theology, and magic, and it finds them all unstable, human inventions, safer not to know than to trust. 3 years later, in 1533, he printed the 3 books of the occult philosophy, the Encyclopedia of Hidden Virtues, Planetary Numbers, Divine Names, and Angelic Orders that later Europe would treat as the master text of ceremonial magic. The same man wrote both 3 years apart. Both books went out under his name. Both books are his. A reader who holds only the Vanity meets a Christian humanist tearing down the schools. A reader who holds only the occult philosophy meets the architect of a 3-world system of magic. A reader who holds both meets the problem. This narration is built to keep open. He printed the attack first. He printed the magic second. He bound chapters of the attack into the magic book's first complete edition. None of those gestures settles the intention. After he died, a 4th book of spirit-conjuring appeared under that name. He never wrote the 4th book. 3 scenes will hold the rest. A Franciscan preaches before a duchess and names a young lecturer a heretic for teaching Jewish books in a Christian school. The lecturer loses the post and begins the life of a man who will not keep a city. An inquisitor, in the week before Christmas, stops a Cologne press that is already setting a magic book. An archbishop forces the press to run. A pupil who once walked a black dog on a rope writes, years later, that the sorcerer's familiar was an animal and that the book of conjuring sold under his teacher's name was a lie. The pictures those scenes turn on have names, and the names will stay put. The occult philosophy, the vanity of the sciences, the 4th book, the Jupiter Square, Melancholia 1. They left the 16th century as paper, copper, and rumor. The paper can be read. The rumor cannot be put back in the bottle. Dior's woman still does not look at the square. The numbers do not need her gaze. 34 along every line, 15 and 14 at the bottom, a year locked into a planetary grid that Arabic mathematicians had already known how to build. Agrippa, when he finally printed the family of such squares, was cataloging an inheritance. The inheritance is what came down. Whether he trusted it is the argument that still divides the people who have read both of his books. What came down is also what failed to come down cleanly. The 1510 draft circulated in handwriting for more than 20 years. The 1533 folio is a doubled and revised text. The 4th book is a later stranger wearing his name. The black dog of the legend is a sentence in an eulogium. The black dog of the household is a pet on a leash. The difference between those transmissions is the whole of the story. He never wrote the 4th book. Begin with Cologne, and the soldier who named himself for a town he may not have been born in. Chapter 2. The Soldier of Nettesheim. Cologne, 1486. The man who printed both books was a citizen's son who styled himself a knight of a smaller place. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa was born in Cologne on the 14th of September, 1486. When he entered the University of that city on the 22nd of July, 1499, the clerk listed him as a citizen of Cologne and wrote his father's name as Henricus de Nettesheim. He would sign himself Agrippa of Nettesheim for the rest of his life. Agrippa is a humanist joke, and a claim at once. Colonia Agrippina was Cologne's Roman name, and to wear it was to borrow an antiquity. Whether the family had truly served the Habsburgs, as he later wrote, is a question his best modern biographer leaves open. Patrons like a lineage. The matriculation book likes a street address. He took the degree of Master of Arts in 1502 at about 16. Cologne's Faculty of Arts still taught Albertus Magnus as a living school, and Agrippa later named Albert's book of astronomical judgment among the first texts that taught him to look for hidden properties in the created world. He also read Pliny's Natural History, that Roman warehouse of stones, herbs, and animals. The medical doctorate he afterward claimed does not sit securely on the record. The double doctorate in church law and civil law is likewise unverified. What can be said without a diploma is simpler. He practiced medicine. He argued law. He never stayed long enough in one city for either profession to look like a career. The years after the master's degree are thin. By 1507 he was in Paris, among a circle of French friends who shared books and a taste for hidden learning. In 1508 and 1509 he went to Spain on what his own later account treats as a military mission. He served as a captain under the Emperor Maximilian and took the title of knight. The battles are not the point. The point is the habit. He moved. The first disgrace arrived on schedule. In 1509, the University of Dole in Burgundy gave him a course of lectures on a book by Johannes Reuchlin on the wonder-working word, printed in 1494. Reuchlin was a Christian jurist who had argued that Hebrew and the Jewish mystical reading of the names of God belonged in a Christian education. Agrippa taught that argument in a Catholic university and hoped it would please Margaret of Austria, the Habsburg princess whose favor opened doors in Burgundy and the Low Countries. He began a declamation on the nobility and preeminence of the female sex, a learned compliment aimed at the same princess. It would not see print until 1529. The compliment never arrived in time. Jean Catiline, the Franciscan provincial for Burgundy, preached before Margaret at Ghent and named Agrippa a Judaizing heretic, a Christian who had, in the preacher's hearing, brought a condemned Jewish art into Christian schools. The charge ended the appointment. In 1510, Agrippa left Dole. He had been a lecturer for a season. He was now a man with a file. He carried the file to England that same year on a diplomatic errand he later called a very secret assignment. From London, he answered Catiline in print. The sentence that survives the quarrel is short. He was a Christian, he wrote, but he did not dislike Jewish rabbis. The defense did not restore the post. It set the pattern. A humanist opens a Hebrew book in a Christian room. A friar names the opening heresy. The humanist writes a fierce reply after the door has already shut. He then returned to Cologne and disputed at the theology faculty of the university that had made him a master of arts. The home faculty did not make him safe. The itinerary resumed. The pattern hardened. From 1511, he followed Maximilian into Italy and remained there for 7 years, lecturing at Pavia on Plato and on a Hermetic dialogue until a French victory broke the appointment. He served a marquess and a duke, practiced medicine, and gathered the Italian reading that would later thicken Book 3. In 1518, Metz made him city advocate. There he defended a woman accused of witchcraft and won her off the stake. The inquisitor of the place made the defense expensive. In 1520, Agrippa resigned and left. Geneva and Freiburg had him next as a physician. Lyon had him as physician to the French king's mother. Each service ended in a quarrel, a debt, or a sudden departure. Soldier, secretary, jurist, physician, the titles piled up because none of them held. The restless disgrace that began at Dole never quite left him. It is the human conflict under the two books. The books look like a riddle in a library. The life looks like a man who could not stop being sent away. He also wrote, in those wandering years, short theological declamations that puzzled even his friends. On original sin, on the sacrament of marriage, on St. Anne's legendary 3 husbands. They would see print only in 1529 in a collected handful issued at Antwerp. The magic book stayed in manuscript. The abbot's sugar was still for the parrot. That winter, after Dole, he went to Würzburg, to an abbot who collected secrets and knew how to hide them. Chapter 3. The Manuscript of 1510. Würzburg, the winter of 1509. A dismissed lecturer carried a book that was not yet a book. Johannes Trithemius was born Johann Heidenberg at Nettesheim in 1462. He had been abbot of Sponheim, a Benedictine house whose library he built into a legend, and by this winter he was at the monastery of St. James in Würzburg. He was a historian of his order, a hunter of manuscripts, and a writer on both magic and secret writing. Agrippa went to him after Dole. They spent a few intense days on a subject both of them already cared about, natural magic, and what a Christian scholar was supposed to do with it in a culture that feared the word. Agrippa finished a compendium he had been assembling. He dedicated the first draft of the occult philosophy to Trithemius. The abbot received the manuscript shortly before the 8th of April, 1510. On that day, Trithemius wrote back. He had examined the work. No living tongue, he said, could express the pleasure it gave him, nor any pen write it. He wondered that a man so young had penetrated secrets hidden from most of the learned, and had set them forth not only clearly and truly, but properly and elegantly. He approved the book. He urged its author to go on toward higher things, and to show the light of true wisdom to the ignorant, as he himself had been divinely enlightened. Idle critics should not pull him off the road. A man sworn to a single faculty was not, in the judgment of the wise, truly learned. Then the abbot gave the rule that would govern the next 20 years. Do not imitate oxen, he wrote. Emulate birds. Particulars are hay. Universals are flight. Communicate vulgar secrets to vulgar friends, but higher and secret things to higher and secret friends only. Give hay to an ox, sugar to a parrot only. Understand the meaning, lest you be trod under the oxen's feet. The letter is dated from the monastery, the 8th of April, 1510. Trithemius approved the writing and forbade the scattering. Sugar for the parrot. The book may exist, and it may even be excellent and still be kept from the market square. Modern scholars have called this a prescription of initiatic silence. The abbot's own words are plainer. An ox will trample what it cannot eat. Agrippa kept the book in manuscript. The dedication copy survives at Würzburg in the university library under the shelf mark that catalogers still cite. Other copies moved. His correspondence shows the draft circulating among friends and curious readers while he went on gathering material to enlarge it. He did not send it to a printer. He was 23 when he dedicated it. The complete printed occult philosophy would not appear until 1533. 23 years stand between the abbot's approval and the Cologne folio. For more than 20 of those years, the book lived as handwriting. The 1510 draft already had the 3-book shape. The printed work would keep a book of natural magic, a book of celestial and mathematical magic, a book of ceremonial and divine magic. It already drew on Marsilio Ficino's medical astral on life, on Giovanni Pico's oration on the dignity of humankind, on Reuchlin's wonder-working word, and on Pliny. It was a young man's synthesis, and the abbot had seen the seams. Birds, not oxen, lift the thing to unity before the book walked. The modern critical edition, which sets the Würzburg manuscript beside the Cologne folio, shows how thoroughly the later Agrippa rewrote his younger self. Whole chapters grew. New authorities entered. The metaphysical frame of Book 1 and the Kabbalistic furniture of Book 3 thickened. The printed book of 1533 is the 1510 book, and is also another book. Transmission here includes the author's own second thoughts, accumulated across the years when he was a syndic, a physician, a courtier, and a man under theological fire. Friends copied the draft anyway. The letters mention the work moving from hand to hand. A manuscript that an abbot has praised becomes a prestige object among humanist readers, even when it is not allowed to become a commodity. That is how a book circulates for a generation without a title page. That is also how a later printer and a still later forger inherited a famous name already attached to a system of magic. The transmission begins in that lift and in that delay. A Christian soldier scholar writes a system of magic, an abbot praises it and hides it, and the hidden book is copied for a generation. What later Europe received as a printed master text began as a manuscript that a Benedictine told a young man not to throw to cattle. Between the letter and the folio lie Dole's closed door, the Italian years, the Met's defense, the French court, the Vanity, and an inquisitor at Christmas. The draft absorbed some of those years and waded through the rest. The abbot had already written a book that looked like a manual for commanding spirits. It was, in large part, a book of ciphers. His own survival record was waiting to rhyme with his pupils. Chapter 4. The Abbot's Cipher. A book that looks like spirit-conjuring can be a book of codes. Trithemius wrote the Steganographia around 1499, while he was still the young abbot of Sponheim. Steganography is the art of hiding a message inside another message. The manuscript circulated in his lifetime. It was not printed until 1606 at Frankfurt, 90 years after his death. On its face, the work is a grimoire of long-distance spirits. 3 books teach the reader how to send a thought across country by commanding named intelligences, with prayers and hours that look, to a hostile eye, exactly like the ceremonial magic the Church had spent centuries trying to fence. A key to the first 2 books was published with the 1606 edition. Those books are cryptography. The angelic names and the ritual padding are a cover text. Under them sit methods for concealing writing, the practical art of a diplomat, an abbot, or any man who had reason not to let a letter travel naked. For the 3rd book, the disguise held much longer. Into the late 20th century, serious readers still took Book 3 for genuine magic. In 1996, Thomas Ernst, and in 1998, Jim Reeds in the journal Cryptologia showed that the 3rd book's formulas are cover texts as well. The spirits recede. More cipher comes forward. The Church did not wait for the cryptographers. The Steganographie went on to the Index of Prohibited Books, the official list of works a Catholic might not read, in 1609. It came off in 1900. For 3 centuries, a book of hidden writing sat among the condemned, as if it had been a manual for raising demons. Some scholars still argue that a mystical theology lives under the ciphers, a pious motive that made secret communication a figure for the soul's reach toward heaven. The formulas, in any case, in cipher instruction. The condemnation did not need to know that. A page that looks like conjuring is enough to earn a place on a list. After Trithemius died in 1516, a more openly cryptographic work, the Polygraphie, was printed in 1518. There he presented practical cipher as something a secular reader could use, the everyday consequence of a theological idea about messages. The soul, specially empowered by God, might reach from earth to heaven. Ordinary men, on his showing, might at least hide a letter. The steganography remained the dangerous twin, manuscript in the author's life, print only in 1606, the index in 1609, a first key in the same year as the print, and a last key at the end of the 20th century. The delay matters. For 100 years after Trithemius's death, anyone who met the steganography in manuscript met a book of spirits. For 300 years after the index listed it, a Catholic reader was told the book was forbidden. The cryptographers arrived late and did not convince everyone. A mystical theological motive can inhabit a cipher. A cipher can inhabit a prayer. The page supports both readings because the author built it that way. What cannot be restored is the first audience's innocence. Once a key exists, the spirits on the surface become a choice rather than a fact. In 1520, a body of magical manuscripts that had been Trithemius's came into Agrippa's hands. The pupil who had been told to give sugar only to a parrot inherited, a decade after the Würzburg letter, part of the teacher's working library. When Agrippa later doubled the occult philosophy for the press, some of the new technical matter in the celestial book came from that inheritance. The abbot's silence and the abbot's shelves both fed the printed text. A library can transmit what a letter forbade to scatter. Agrippa, enlarging Book 2, used the shelves. He still waited 13 more years before he used a press. The rhyme is the survival record, and the men themselves did not arrange it as a lesson. Trithemius wrote a book that looked like magic and was, at least in its decoded books, code. It was condemned. It was understood late. Agrippa wrote a book of magic, withheld it, attacked all learning, including magic, then printed the magic book complete. And after his death, a forged fourth book of genuine spirit conjuring was sold under his name. The teacher's book was mistaken for a grimoire. The student's name was later attached to a grimoire he had refused to write. In both cases, the look of the page outran the author. A later age that wanted sorcerers found them on the title page and stopped. The title page is part of the record. It is also the part that lies most easily. He never wrote the fourth book. The book he did write has 3 rooms. The first room is the world of herbs, stones, and the 4 elements. Walk it before the numbers start to count themselves. Chapter 5. The 3 worlds. The occult philosophy is a house with 3 stories, and each story is a world. Agrippa says so in the 2nd chapter of the 1st book. Magic, in his definition, is the most perfect accomplishment of the noblest philosophy. Not of natural philosophy only, as Pico had written a generation earlier, but of the whole of learned inquiry gathered into one operative knowledge. The cosmos, in the Neoplatonic picture he inherited, has 3 levels, and so the book has 3 books. Book 1 treats natural magic, the elemental world. Here are the 4 elements and the hidden properties of herbs, stones, animals, and the human body. An occult virtue, in this vocabulary, is a hidden property. A thing is said to hold above its obvious ones, the healing attributed to a plant, the talismanic quality assigned to a gem. Agrippa explains those virtues by a chain of correspondence. Eternal ideas imprint the stars imprint sublunary forms. A stone or a leaf therefore carries, in miniature, a celestial cause. Between heavenly souls and earthly bodies there moves a world spirit, an ethereal mediator. The Latin calls spiritus mundi. The magus of Book 1 works by attracting that spirit through natural correspondences, sympathy, antipathy, mixture, timing. Pliny's warehouse and Albert's judgments are here rebuilt as a single physics of hidden causes. Book 2 climbs to celestial and mathematical magic. Stars, planets, numbers, and geometry become the instruments. The magus stands as a go-between who subjects the lower world to the heavens by knowing how influence flows down. Here, Agrippa sets out astrological images and talismans, the mystical properties of number, and the plates of the human frame measured as a small cosmos. He draws technical detail from Ficino's On Obtaining Life from the Heavens and from the medieval astral magic manuscripts that had sat on Trithemius's shelves. Harmony, in this book, is a structure that can be numbered. Astrology, which the Vanity would later call a fallacious conjecture in the hands of liars, remains in Book 2 the much-needed key for all secrets. The two judgments sit in the same career. Campai treats the contradiction as only apparent. A science is bad when it denies freedom and providence, and good when a Christian magus uses it to read a world God made. That reading belongs to the open argument. The page of Book 2 simply keeps the stars. Book 3 reaches the intellectual or super-celestial world and treats ceremonial magic, divine names, angels, the Christian Kabbalah, and theurgy, which is ritual aimed at divine or angelic spirits. Religion, Agrippa writes, must guard the work, or superstition and deceit rush in. He condemns gohita, the art of commanding demons, as superstition and deception. The genuine third book ends in piety, or in the claim of piety. The forged book that later stole his name would do the thing this book refuses. The printed folio of 1533 carries woodcuts that later readers know before they know a sentence of the Latin. A man stands inscribed in a pentagram, the signs of the 5 visible planets at the points, the human body treated as a 5-fold measure. Other plates set a man in a square and a man in a circle, navel or groin as center, the Vitruvian commonplace redrawn for a magical encyclopedia. A zodiac body maps the 12 signs onto the parts of a human figure, a medieval medical astrological image, a melotise that Agrippa inherited and that he did print. One plate measures a man with feet together as an equilateral quadrature whose center falls at the bottom of the belly. Another aligns the navel with the center of the square, the girdling of the body. Grafton, reading the 1533 book as a cabinet of curiosities with a metaphysics inside it, treats these diagrams as demonstrations of proportion, measure, and harmony. They are also the images a later ceremonial tradition would lift and reuse until the Latin around them fell away. Macrocosm and microcosm, the greater world and the human frame, are the grammar of these pictures. Agrippa, polishing the text for the press, added a sentence that compares the chain of influence to a well-tuned lute. Touch one end of the string and the whole immediately shakes. The 1510 draft lacked that last clause. The printed book wants you to hear the cosmos as an instrument. The plates claim that the two worlds are matching instruments. The claim is the plates. The survival is the paper. The 1533 text is not the 1510 draft with a new title page. Ficino, Pico, Reuchlin, Pliny, and Albertus Magnus were already in the youthful book. The printed version also draws on Francesco Giorgio's Harmony of the World, on Paulus Riccius's Latin Kabbalah, and on Reuchlin's later On the Kabbalistic Art of 1517. Campai's edition, which sets the Würzburg manuscript beside the Cologne folio, shows a book that roughly doubled in length. New metaphysics stiffens the old inventory. The three worlds remain the architecture. Read the pentagram man as a document. A body, a star, 5 planets, a printed claim that measure is destiny. The next claim is more precise, and it can be checked with a pencil. The planets have squares, and the squares add up. Chapter 6. The numbers that do not lie. A square of numbers does not care who believes in it. Book 2 of the Occult Philosophy prints a family of planetary magic squares. Later readers call them kamayas, from a Hebrew word for an amulet, the square treated as a thing one might wear. Agrippa did not invent them. He gave the Latin West its most copied printed set. The 7 traditional planets receive squares of rising order. Saturn is 3 by 3. Jupiter is 4 by 4. Mars is 5 by 5. The Sun is 6, Venus 7, Mercury 8, the Moon 9. The line sum grows with the order. Saturn's lines add to 15. Jupiter's add to 34. That 34 is the same sum Dürer locked into Melancholia, 1 in 1514. The other sums can be left on the page. The structure is the point: 1 planet, 1 order, 1 constant. The squares came west through the Arabic wafka tradition. A wafka is a harmonious numerical arrangement. In many Islamic examples, a divine name or the first letters of a Quranic verse occupy the top row, the lower rows permute them. Because Arabic letters, like Hebrew letters, carry numerical values, a letter square is already a number square. The great medieval handbook of astral magic that Latin readers called the Picatrix, translated from Arabic in the 13th century, belongs to this stream. A treatise on magic squares, possibly by the Byzantine scholar Manuel Moschopoulos, sits bound with a 15th century Picatrix at Krakow, and a modern student of Agrippa's seals pointed to that pairing as a likely source. Luca Pacioli, writing around 1500, already described the Jupiter figure of 4 by 4 that sums to 34 and attributed it to the astronomers. The mathematics was a known object before Agrippa was born. Dürer's square is that Jupiter object, rearranged so that 15 and 14 fall in the bottom center. He did not take it from Agrippa's unpublished manuscript. The printed Occult Philosophy was still 19 years away, and the square had already been traveling in medieval handbooks. What Agrippa later printed and what Dürer had already cut is the same inheritance. Panofsky, in the 20th century, argued that Dürer's types of melancholy drew on Agrippa's then circulating draft. Other historians have challenged the need for that manuscript. The numbers do not require the argument. They sit in both places. The book tells the reader what the Jupiter square is for. If this magic square is stamped on a silver plate at a time when Jupiter rules, Agrippa writes, it provides profit and wealth, grace and love, peace and concord with men. It placates enemies and confirms honors, dignities, and counsels. Inscribed on coral, it destroys evil spells. That is the claim on the page. What can be tried with a pencil is the addition. Rows, columns, diagonals, the 4 corners, each quadrant, the center 4, 34 returns. Dürer's version is also associative. Pairs of cells opposite the center add to 17, and it hides still more combinations that sum to the same constant. The arithmetic is public. Grafton has reconstructed one medieval route into the Jupiter grid. Write 1 through 16 in order, leave half the numbers in place, rotate the other half by 180 degrees, and the fortunate square falls into shape. Dürer's further swap puts the year where a later eye cannot miss it. You can perform the construction on scrap paper. The construction does not require a planet. The tradition required a planet, a metal, and an hour. Those three requirements are the magic. The fourth requirement is belief, and belief is the part that left the classroom. Seals travel with the squares. Agrippa's figures show how later operators traced the letter values of Hebrew names of planetary spirits and intelligences across the grid, and so drew a sigil from a sum. The documentation of that tracing, as far as the modern literature can see, begins in Agrippa. The squares themselves are older. He systematized a transmission. He did not originate the integers. He did not, or integers. The number survived when the magic was abandoned. Schoolbooks now teach Diora's square as a curiosity of recreational mathematics. Ceremonial magic manuals of later centuries lifted Agrippa's tables and left his philosophy on the floor. You can add the lines without believing in Jupiter. That is why the object is still here. A belief can be lost. A line sum cannot. The Saturn square of 3, the Mars square of 5, the long lunar square of 9, they all add, and they all outlive the hours and the metals assigned to them. Book 2 printed a family. Later, Europe kept the integers and argued about the rest. Book 3 leaves the integers and takes up names. Hebrew names, angelic names, the names of God, and the Christian reading of a Jewish mystical art. The dignity of that art is not Agrippa's to confer. It was already a religion. Chapter 7. The Christian Kabbalah. Book 3 opens a Jewish library with Christian keys. Kabbalah is the Jewish mystical reading of Scripture and of the Hebrew names of God. It is a religious form, still living, and it is older than the Renaissance men who translated pieces of it into Latin. Christian Kabbalah is the name historians give to the Christian appropriation of those methods, Pico, Reuchlin, and then Agrippa, reading Hebrew mysteries as confirmations of a Christian cosmos. The appropriation can be reverent. It can also be extractive. Both things are true of the 16th century page. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola in 1486 published 900 theses and declared that magic and Kabbalah were compatible with Christianity. Magic, for Pico, was the most perfect accomplishment of natural philosophy. Johannes Reuchlin, the Hebraist Agrippa had lectured on at Dole, gave the next generation its textbooks on the wonder-working word in 1494 and on the Kabbalistic art in 1517. Reuchlin set out the power of the divine names and divided the wonder-working art into kinds. He warned that each kind carried a risk, and he favored a fourth way that turned on the holy name of Christ. Agrippa, when he built Book 3, was more inclusive. He wanted all three worlds, natural, celestial, ceremonial, kept inside a single reformed magic, provided religion stood guard. The printed third book, therefore, catalogues what a Latin Christian could take from this reception. It treats the 10 names of God. It treats the Sephirot, the 10 emanations or attributes that, in Kabbalistic cosmology, surround the infinite. It treats angels and demons, and the Hebrew sacred names understood as vehicles of power. Agrippa's youthful draft had already analogized those names to the barbara verba, the strange or foreign words of ancient theurgy. The 1533 text, thickened by later Latin Kabbalistic reading, makes the angelology and the divine names more ample. Reuchlin's 1517 book, which the 1510 draft could not have used, is among the later sources. So are Paulus Riccius's Latin introductions to Hebrew writings. The Christian Kabbalah, Agrippa, Prince, is a library built in Latin, from Latin toward a Latin reader who wanted Hebrew power without Hebrew community. Pico had been more famous than precise. Reuchlin had been more precise than inclusive. Agrippa wanted the inclusive system, natural magic, celestial magic, and this ceremonial third story kept together, with religion as the lock on the door. Book 3 therefore spends as much time on moral purification and faith as it does on names. The true magus in Agrippa's closing ideal is philosopher, operator, and priest. The ideal is a claim about who may handle the names. It is also a claim the forged fourth book would ignore. Two techniques need their definitions on the first hearing. Gematria assigns numbers to Hebrew letters and reads words as sums. A name becomes an integer, and integers can be compared. Notaricon reads the initials of a phrase as a hidden word, a compression of a sentence into a cipher name. Both are traditional Kabbalistic methods. Agrippa transmits them in Latin dress as part of the ceremonial equipment of Book 3. He also deepens the human being as microcosm. The 1533 text draws on his own unfinished writing, on humankind and on the great Kabbalistic book as a Latin reader could meet it, mediated by Francesco Yorjo's Harmony of the World. The soul in this account has 3 parts, and the printed book gives them their Hebrew names: Neshama, the mind; Ruah, reason; Nefesh, the sensitive soul. They have different origins and different destinies after death. Mind, as the breath of God, returns. Reason undergoes judgment according to the choices it made. The sensitive soul dissolves. The scheme is eschatology in the form of psychology. It is also a reuse of the Platonic tripartite soul Agrippa had already been thinking with in his shorter theological works. How much of this he grasped and how much he borrowed remains an open scholarly question. He worked from Latin Christian Kabbalistic texts and translations, Paulus Riccius among them, not from a documented life inside a Jewish study house. Kampahi calls the openness second-hand. The phrase is a description of the sources, not a sneer at the man. A second-hand library can still be a serious library. It cannot make its owner a rabbi. The dignity of Kabbalah does not depend on Agrippa's competence. Jewish mystics did not write in order to furnish a cologne folio with angelic tables. Christian Kabbalah is a historical reception, and Book 3 is one of its densest Latin monuments. Read it as a monument. The names on the page are religion's names, reprinted by a soldier scholar who had already been called a Judaizing heretic for opening this door at Dole. He opened another door in 1530, and this time the theologians did not need a Hebrew word to walk through it. He published a book that called all of this vain. Chapter 8, The Vanity of the Sciences. In 1530, the author of a hidden magic book published an attack on every science he could name, magic included. The Latin title is a sentence on the uncertainty and vanity of the arts and sciences, and the excellence of the Word of God, an invective declamation. Call it the vanity of the sciences. Agrippa told a friend in September 1526 that the piece existed. He was then physician to Louise of Savoy, the French king's mother, and the appointment was already in ruins. She had stripped his pension. He had refused her an astrological forecast and spoken of her superstition. He was forbidden to leave France. The tone of the book owes something to that humiliation. The book is larger than humiliation. Johannes Graffius printed it at Antwerp in 1530. Further editions followed in Antwerp, Cologne, and Paris. A German translation appeared in 1534, Italian in 1543, English in 1569, other vernaculars later. Europe could read the attack while the occult philosophy was still, in its complete form, unprinted. Agrippa, in his usual way, had gone on revising up to the moment of publication. The 1526 announcement and the 1530 book are the same project at two dates. How finished the piece was in 1526, Campai says, cannot be established. A declamation is a rhetorical set piece that argues a case, often to the edge of paradox, rather than a treatise that states a doctrine. Erasmus's praise of folly is the formal cousin. Mart van der Poel, who has studied Agrippa's shorter orations as a Latinist, reads the vanity inside that humanist genre, a fight with scholastic theologians about method and authority, staged as a parade. The parade is long. Grammar and dance, theology and hunting, medicine, law and magic walk past the same bench. Each is an unstable human invention. Each becomes harmful when it pretends to certainty. Agrippa writes that the structure of the sciences is so risky, it is much safer not to know anything than to have knowledge. The book ends with an ironic praise of the ass, the beast simple enough to carry a god into Jerusalem. Magic stands inside the indictment. The author of the 1510 manuscript does not exempt his own subject. That fact created the problem scholars still call, for convenience, the recantation problem. The problem is genuine. The solutions are not agreed. Charles Nauert, in 1965, read the Vanity as evidence of an evolution, a mind moving away from youthful occult belief toward a skeptical crisis in Renaissance thought. Richard Popkin, writing The History of Skepticism, denied the book a serious epistemological analysis. He placed it nearer anti-intellectualism and biblical fideism, an appeal to the Word of God rather than a Sextus-style dismantling of knowledge. Van der Poel refuses the simple recantation. For him, the battle of the vanity is a humanist. Theologians' war on the schools, not a change of vote on the occult philosophy. Paula Zambali has stressed continuity and reform, and has argued for Agrippa's crypto-Protestant leanings on her reading. Trithemius's prescribed silence and the later printed magic are not cancelled by the 1530 attack. Vittoria Perone Compagnie, editor of the critical Latin text, treats the two works as one project. The vanity is the destructive half. It names the wreckage of Christian learning. The occult philosophy is the constructive half, a restored true magic inside a Neoplatonic and Hermetic theology. Christopher Leyrick reads the occult philosophy as a linguistic system, a language of demons and angels, and treats the paradox as structural rather than as a conversion that a biographer can date. Michael Kiefer, in 1988, left the dilemma standing, Hermetic rebirth on one side, the ambivalences of the two books on the other. These are not shades of one opinion. They are incompatible accounts of what the same pages mean. The episode does not pick a winner. The disagreement is the record. The theologians did not wait for the historians. By 1530, Agrippa was in the Low Countries as archivist and historiographer to Margaret of Austria, governor for her nephew Charles V. She asked the Louvain faculty for a judgment. They condemned the vanity as scandalous, impious, and heretical. The Sorbonne condemned the Paris edition. The list of offending passages is dated the 2nd of March, 1531. The Parlement at Miquelon required an answer. Agrippa wrote a defense and a complaint. refused to recant and accused his opponents of ignorance and bad faith. Erasmus, who had noticed the storm, advised him not to antagonize the ecclesiastical orders. The advice was not taken. The career at Margaret's court ended. He had come to Antwerp to print and to rest. He printed. He did not rest. The Louvain articles and the Sorbonne articles are documents of a man who would rather write a complaint than withdraw a declamation. Van der Poel has printed the Sorbonne list. The fight is on paper, and the paper is the point. He did not stop work on the occult philosophy. Book 1 went to press the next year. He never wrote the 4th book. He did write this one, and he wrote it against his own subject. Whether that sentence is repentance, rhetoric, or cover is the argument that will not close. Cologne was next, and a Dominican who could stop a press. Chapter 9. The book escapes the censor. Christmas, 1532. The type was already in the press when the inquisitor moved. In 1531, Johannes Graffius, the same Antwerp printer who had issued the Vanity, brought out an enlarged Book 1 of the occult philosophy, dedicated to Hermann von Wied, Archbishop-Elector of Cologne. A table of contents for Books 2 and 3 rode with it, a promise of the rest. Paris, from the shop of Chrétien Veckel, and Cologne, printed Book 1 in the same season. Those first book issues are rare now. They were already a provocation then. A reader in 1531 could buy the Elemental World and a map of the 2 worlds still to come. The celestial and ceremonial books remained for 2 more years, a table of contents and a threat. Agrippa had secured an imperial privilege, an official license protecting a book's printing at Antwerp for his longer works. The privilege of Charles V appears on the 1533 title page verso in French. Catalogers have called the French verso a double anomaly, an imperial license on a Latin magic book in the vernacular of the Burgundian court. The emperor was Margaret's nephew. Agrippa had been her archivist and historiographer. Her death in 1530 weakened that shelter. A short imprisonment for debt at Brussels followed. Protection, by 1532, had to come from somewhere else. A privilege can keep a pirate printer off a title page. It cannot keep a Dominican out of a senate. In June of that year, Hermann von Wied took Agrippa into his household. The archbishop had a taste for occult learning and a sympathy for moderate religious reform. He could open a cologne shop. Agrippa delivered the complete 3-book text to the printer, Johannes Soter. By November, Soter was typesetting. Shortly before Christmas, the Dominican Inquisitor Conrad Curlin denounced the book as heretical and blasphemous. An inquisitor is a church officer with the power to stop a book. Curlin used it. He obtained from the city's senate a suspension of the printing. The sheets already set did not, by themselves, make a book. A stopped press is a kind of silence Trithemius had never commanded. Agrippa wrote an appeal to the Cologne Senate. The text survives in the modern discussion of the case. It is impassioned, and it did not break the impasse. The Senate had an inquisitor to satisfy. A dismissed historiographer's rhetoric was not enough. Hermann intervened. The archbishop's pressure, not the author's letter, restarted the work. The complete occult philosophy appeared at Cologne in 1533 from Soter's shop. Some copies omit the printer's name and the place, a prudence the moment explains. Bibliographers distinguish several 1533 issues by small typographical differences. Some copies carry a title page portrait. The book that left the shop is the revised, expanded text, roughly twice the 1510 draft. It did not leave alone. The 1533 volume appends the chapters of the Vanity that criticize magic. Book 3, in the same printing, contains Agrippa's own palinode. He wrote the 3 books while very young. What was then erroneous, through the curiosity of youth, he is now willing to have retracted. He formerly spent time and cost on these vanities. Those who divine by the deceits of devils, by exorcisms, incantations, and idolatrous works will share the fate of Janus and Jambres and of Simon Magus. Kampahi reads that recantation as an admission of the limits of the first project, rather than a global taking back. Other readers have taken the same paragraph as a confession. The paragraph sits in the magic book beside the Vanity's borrowed attack under an imperial privilege after an inquisitor failed to kill the edition. The arrangement is a fact. The intention is the open argument of the previous chapter, still open. A reader of 1533 therefore met, in one binding, the fullest printed system of learned magic in Europe and the author's published case against magic. Hermann had forced the sheets through. Sotair had set them. Curlin had failed to stop them. Charles's privilege stood on the verso. The appendix and the palinode stood at the back. Anyone who wants a single Agrippa has to tear the volume apart. The volume refuses. Later, Catholic indexes listed Agrippa's writings. The Louvain Index and others of the late 1540s and 1550 placed the occult philosophy among forbidden texts. That is another chapter of the same survival. In 1533, the immediate fact is simpler. A Dominican stopped a press. An archbishop started it again. The book got out. Curlin had named it heretical and blasphemous. Hermann had named it worth printing. The Senate had named it suspended. The sheets, once bound, named themselves. A privilege in French, a portrait on some copies, an appendix of recantation, and 3 books of magic. The object that left Cologne is already an argument in boards. He never wrote the 4th book. Someone else would write it for him, and Europe would believe the signature. Chapter 10. The 4th book. Marburg, 1559. A dead man's name sold a book of conjuring. 24 years after Johann Bayer recorded Agrippa's death, a Latin volume appeared at Marburg under the title Liber Quartus de Occulta Philosophia, Su de Ceremoniis Magicis, the 4th book of occult philosophy, or of magical ceremonies. It offered what the genuine 3 books had refused to offer: practical spirit conjuring, ceremonial instructions, more explicit than anything in Agrippa's own ceremonial book. Goetia, the art of commanding demons, which Book 3 had condemned as superstition and deception, here becomes the method. The early printed tradition bundled this 4th book with the Heptameron, or magical elements, a text attributed to Pietro da Banno, the medieval physician and philosopher who died in 1316. That attribution is itself a pseudepigraph, a work circulating under a famous name. Pietro did not write the Heptameron. Agrippa did not write the 4th book. The 2 false signatures traveled together, and later English gatherings, including Robert Turner's of 1655, folded in geomancy and other short texts to make a thicker packet. The author of the 4th book is unknown. Historians and bibliographers have treated the work as a forgery since the century that produced it. Wait, in the early 20th century, separated it cleanly from the genuine corpus. a rare modern hesitation. Stephen Skinner, in 1978, exists and has not become the field. The default judgment was given early and in print by a man who had lived in Agrippa's house. Johann Weyer was born in 1515. He studied under Agrippa in the last years at Bonn, while the teacher was under Hermann's protection, and after the Cologne folio had already appeared. In 1563, Weyer published De Praestigiis Daemonum, On the Tricks of Demons, the book that would make him, for later readers, the first great opponent of the witch hunts. He argued there that many women accused of witchcraft were melancholy, deluded, or tortured into confession, and that the devil's supposed pacts were, in those cases, a cruel reading of illness and fear. In the same book, he denounced the fourth book as spurious. The Conjuring Manual was not his teacher's work. The denunciation has remained the scholarly position. It did not stop the printers. Weyer had the motive of loyalty and the motive of method. A teacher who had condemned Goethe in Book 3 and who had appended the Vanity's attack on magic to the 1533 folio made a poor author for a handbook of ceremonial evocation. A pupil who was building a case against the witch hunts had no use for a famous Christian humanist recast as a spirit master. Both motives can be true at once. The judgment does not require a saint. It requires a reader who knew the man and the genuine books. Editions of the occult philosophy began to carry the fourth book as if the system had always had 4 rooms. Hostile readers pointed to the conjuring pages as proof that Agrippa's learning ended in traffic with spirits. Friendly readers, or merely curious ones, bought a practical supplement to a book that had been, in Agrippa's hands, a philosophical encyclopedia with a pious third story. The 1651 English Occult Philosophy and the 1655 English Fourth Book taught 2 generations of Anglophone readers to hear one author's voice in both. A forgery is a kind of transmission. It moves a name into a genre the name had refused. The genuine Book 3 had ended in religion and in a palinode. The false Book 4 begins where a customer of grimoires prefers to begin. Pseudepigraphy in a religious literature can be a form of homage. This particular false signature is closer to a market. The homage, if any, is to the rumor. Who forged it remains unanswered. No colophon names a living writer. No confession has surfaced. Ayers! Marburg in 1559 was a Protestant university town with a press willing to print occult Latin, that is, a climate, not a signature. Who denied it is on the record, Weyer, 1563, in the open. Why the lie outran the man is the easier historical question. A book of ceremonies is easier to fear than a humanist folio with a skeptical twin. It is also easier to sell. Later, Catholic indexes had already begun to list Agrippa's genuine writings. A spurious fourth book confirmed what the hostile indexes implied. Printers, meanwhile, could offer customers Agrippa Complete. Completeness is a commercial virtue. Accuracy is a slower one. The necromancer that later Europe knew, Faust's learned cousin, the black dog Magus, the cautionary doctor, was assembled from this signature and from the rumors that loved it. The 3 authentic books are still in the libraries. The reputation was built from the 4th. Bibliography took centuries to pull them apart. Popular memory never did the work. He never wrote the 4th book. The reputation needed one more prop, and it found one in the house. There was a dog. A pupil had walked it. A bishop of letters made it a demon. Chapter 11. the Black Dog. The most famous demon in Agrippa's biography was walked on a rope. Paolo Joveo Paulus Jovius to the Latin readers. To the Latin readers was a bishop, a physician, and a writer of elegies, short lives of learned men designed to travel. In his Elogia Doctorum Virorum, he gave Agrippa a familiar spirit in the shape of a black dog. At the point of death, in Joveo's telling, Agrippa cast the animal off with a cry, "Go, vile beast, by whom I am brought utterly to perdition." Later demonologists repeated the scene and hardened it. In some retellings, the dog runs to a river and drowns. French versions have put the water as the Rhone. The cry, the caller, the drowning, these are the legend's moving parts. They are Jovio's gift to a reputation the fourth book had already begun to invent. Bayer, who had lived in the house, wrote a different sentence. The dog was a dog. It was black, of moderate size, and named Monsieur in French. If anyone knew him well, Bayer said, he did, because he had often walked him on a rope leash while studying under Agrippa. The pupil of the last years is the only witness who had held the lead. He was also, by 1563, the author of a book arguing that many accused witches were melancholy or deluded rather than confederates of the devil. He had professional reasons to distrust a familiar spirit story. He also had a memory of a specific animal, a French pet name, and a rope. The legend ate the memory. Once the fourth book had turned Agrippa into a conjurer, the dog became evidence. A necromancer keeps a familiar. A familiar takes an animal's body. A black dog is the correct color for the part. Jovio supplied the deathbed theater. Compilers of demonological handbooks, a generation on, did not need Bayer's leash. They needed the cry. The man who had written the Vanity of the Sciences and appended its attack on magic to his own magic book became, in the popular afterlife, a doctor who unbuckled a demon and sent it to drown. The Faust story was hungry for exactly this furniture. Johannes Manlius, a student of Melanchthon, writing in 1563, the same year as Bayer's book, compared Faust's dog familiar to Agrippa's. The comparison assumes what Joveo had already supplied, that Agrippa's animal was the type. Christopher Marlowe, in Dr. Faustus, around 1592, named Agrippa as a model of forbidden learning, the scholar whose art a German student might envy. The play does not need the dog. It needs the name as a summit of illicit knowledge. In Goethe's Faust, more than 2 centuries later, Mephistopheles first arrives as a black poodle. The path from Monsieur to that poodle is a lineage of images, not a documented theft of a single line. A historical dog, a humanist elogium, a forged book of ceremonies, and a theatrical devil in fur. The record shows the sequence. The sequence does not require a conspiracy. It requires printers, playwrights, and a public already trained to see a scholar's pet as a spirit. Agrippa, in the genuine books, had written against the popular figure of the witch and had, at Metz, taken a real woman's side against an inquisitor. Bayer extended that humane suspicion into a medical argument. The legend reversed the direction. It made the advocate of the accused into the accused's master, and the household animal into the proof. Reception can invert a life without forging a new document. Here, it had the fourth book to help. The debunk is the stranger half. Bayer is the household, not a later skeptic guessing. He walked the dog. He named the dog. He then spent a career arguing that the devil's supposed contracts with village women were, in many cases, a cruel reading of illness and fear. The most famous demonic animal in Renaissance biography was, on the only intimate testimony, a pet. The testimony is in print. The legend is also in print. Print did not choose the pupil. It chose the cry, because a cry ends a life more cleanly than a leash. Jovio wrote elegies to make learned men memorable. He succeeded. The Agrippa who remains in the popular ear is Jovio's Agrippa, wearing Weier's dog as a demon. The pupil published first, in the same year as Manlius's comparison, and still arrived second. Grenoble was still ahead of the legend. The man would die there poor, and the two genuine books would begin their separate afterlives, one into ceremonial magic, one into the skeptical tradition, while a third book he never wrote went on making him a sorcerer. Chapter 12. What the Vanity Meant. Grenoble, 1535. The correspondence had already stopped. Agrippa's last surviving letters date from July 1533, the year the occult philosophy escaped Cologne. Weyer, who knew the household, wrote that his teacher remained at Bonn until 1535, then returned to France, was arrested on the order of Francis I for disparaging remarks about the Queen Mother Louise of Savoy, and was soon released. He died at Grenoble in 1535, the year the pupil recorded. Compaye, who has lived with the documents as long as anyone now living, allows 1536 as the latest possibility. Later encyclopedias give a February day. The day is a compiler's convenience. The place is the fact that held, he died poor. Later accounts put the death in extreme poverty, perhaps at the city's hospital, perhaps in a government official's house. He had been married more than once, the older biographical tradition says 3 times, and left children, 3 sons, one later writer reports, survived him. He was reportedly buried at the Dominican convent in Grenoble. The room is not on the record. The city is. A man who had lectured at Dole and Pavia, advocated at Metz, served a queen mother and an emperor's aunt, and slept under an archbishop's roof, ended in a provincial capital without a pension. The exile completed itself. Did he believe it, or was the whole book a warning? 4 facts about a transmission will have to do, because the pages will not sit still for a verdict. First, in April 1510, a man of 23 dedicated a manuscript of magic to an abbot who told him to give hay to an ox and sugar to a parrot. The manuscript circulated for more than 20 years. The complete book was printed in 1533. Würzburg still holds the dedication copy. Second, the same man published the Vanity of the Sciences in 1530 and the Occult Philosophy in 1533, and he bound the Vanity's attack on magic into the magic book's first complete edition, together with a palinode in his own voice. Neert read A Change of Mind. Popkin read Fiddism. Van der Poel read A Humanist Declamation. Zambali read Continuity and Reform. Kampahi read one project in 2 movements. Lyric read a language that contains its own doubt. Kiefer left the dilemma open. They are all still reading the same 2 books. Third, he never wrote the 4th book. Weyer said so in 1563. The unknown author of 1559 still made the necromancer. Jovio gave the necromancer a dog. Weyer, who had walked the dog, gave the dog back its name. The legend preferred Joveo. Fourth, the Jupiter square in Diorer's Melancholia I, dated 1514, and the Jupiter square in Agrippa's Book II, printed 1533, are the same mathematical object. Rows, columns, diagonals, 34. 15 and 14 at the bottom of the engraving, the year locked into a grid Arabic mathematicians already knew how to build. The numbers remain after the magic is set down. The afterlives split along the same seam. The occult philosophy became the master key of later Western ceremonial magic. John Dee read it and built on its correspondences and its angelology, a further celestial art of his own. Giordano Bruno treated Agrippa as a pioneer of natural and divine magic. The English translation of 1651, signed J.F. John French or James Freak, the catalogs still divide. Put the three books into the Anglophone world, where cunning men and later orders could mine the tables without the Latin. 19th and 20th century occult revivals lifted the kamayas, the names, and the plates again. Francis Yates wrote that the book stood central not only to the spread of Renaissance magic, but also to the reaction against it. The Vanity of the Sciences took the other road into the skeptical and Fideist tradition. Later histories have claimed it for Montaigne, for Descartes, for Goethe. Popkin granted Agrippa a place in the revival of Pyrrhonian doubt and denied him the analysis that would make the place comfortable. Mary Shelley, in 1818, let young Victor Frankenstein catch fire from Agrippa, Paracelsus, and Albertus, an 18th century idea of the magus as the prehistory of science. Reception is not intention. It is what the books did, after the man stopped being able to argue with them. The fourth book and the Black Dog did a third kind of work, and they did it in the street. He never wrote the fourth book. He wrote two books that refused to cancel each other, and he died before the argument about them had properly begun. You are left with a manuscript, a stop press, an archbishop's intervention, a forged signature, a rope leash, and a square of 16 numbers that adds to 34, no matter who is watching. The winged woman in Dior's plate still does not look at that square. She did not need to. The integers keep the year without her, and they keep it without him. The record does not resolve whether he believed the magic. That refusal is the thing that came down. The legend had an answer ready. The library still does not.